There's a stretch of road in southeastern Wisconsin where the corn grows tall enough to hide anything. Bray Road. 2 lanes of cracked asphalt cutting through farmland that looks the same as it did 50 years ago. At night, the fog rolls in low and thick, settling between the stalks like something breathing. The air smells like wet earth and diesel fuel. Your headlights only reach so far. This is where people saw something they couldn't explain. Something that walked on 2 legs but shouldn't have. Something that looked back at them with eyes that reflected light like an animal's, but held their gaze like a person's. Everyone thinks the Beast of Bray Road was hunting deer, or maybe people. That's what the newspapers said. That's what the documentaries suggested. That's what gets repeated in every campfire story and late-night paranormal podcast. The legend has taken on a life of its own, growing more dramatic and more monstrous with each retelling. But that's not what the reports really say. Not if you read them carefully. Not if you listen to what the witnesses actually described, instead of what everyone assumed they meant. This isn't a story about a monster. It's a story about what happens when people decide something is a monster. It's about fear and assumption, and the violence that comes when we encounter something we don't understand. It's about what that thing does when it realizes what we've decided it is. And it's about a landscape that remembers things we've forgotten. I've spent years reading through these reports. Police records, newspaper archives, interviews with witnesses who never wanted their names published. I've driven down Bray Road more times than I can count, at every hour of the day and night. I've walked into those cornfields and stood in the darkness listening. And the more I learned, the more I realized that almost everything people think they know about the Beast of Bray Road is wrong. Not because the witnesses were lying, but because we never asked the right questions. We saw something strange and immediately decided what it had to be. A predator. A threat. A monster that needed to be stopped. We never considered that maybe we were the ones who needed to stop. That maybe the real story wasn't about what it was doing there, but about what we did when we found it. The legend of the Beast of Bray Road started in the late 1980s, though some say the sightings go back further, buried in local folklore that nobody took seriously until someone gave it a name. The official story goes like this. Multiple witnesses, mostly driving alone at night, reported seeing a large, wolf-like creature walking upright along or near Bray Road in Elkhorn, Wisconsin. Some said it was covered in dark fur, shaggy and matted. Others described it as having a canine face with an elongated snout, broad shoulders that seemed too wide for any natural animal, and long arms that hung at its sides when it walked. It stood anywhere from 6 to 7 feet tall, depending on who you asked. Some witnesses said it had a tail. Others said it didn't. The local newspaper ran the story in 1992. Then the regional papers picked it up. Then the tabloids. Then the cryptozoology enthusiasts arrived with their theories and their equipment and their absolute certainty that they were on the verge of discovering something that would change everything. Werewolf, they said. Dogman. Some kind of undiscovered species, a remnant population of dire wolves that somehow survived into the modern era. Maybe a genetic mutation. Maybe a hybrid of wolf and bear. Maybe something even stranger. The comparisons were immediate and dramatic. This was Wisconsin's answer to Bigfoot, they said. A genuine North American cryptid, proof that the wild places of this country still held secrets. Proof that not everything had been cataloged and explained and stripped of its mystery. People came from other states to hunt it. Documentary crews arrived. Amateur investigators with night vision cameras and audio recorders staked out the area for weeks at a time. The reports followed a pattern, which only made the legend more credible in the eyes of believers. Late night, usually between 10 p.m. and 3 a.m. Rural road, always isolated, always far from town. Headlights catching something at the edge of the tree line or crossing the asphalt in the space between streetlights. Witnesses would slam on their brakes, hearts pounding in their chests, hands gripping the steering wheel, and the thing would either bolt into the darkness or turn and stare before disappearing into the corn or the woods. No one was ever hurt. No one was ever chased. No one ever had a prolonged encounter that lasted more than a few seconds. But everyone was terrified. The media loved it. Local TV stations sent crews to interview residents, setting up their cameras on Bray Road itself, doing stand-ups in front of cornfields and abandoned barns. Paranormal investigators showed up with EMF detectors and infrared cameras, sitting in their cars all night, waiting for something to appear. The story grew with each retelling. Details got sharper, more dramatic, more monstrous. What started as uncertain sightings of something strange became definitive encounters with a beast. Witnesses who had been hesitant and confused in their initial reports became confident and clear in follow-up interviews, their memories sharpening to match what people expected them to say. But here's the thing. When you go back to those initial reports, before the story became a legend, before witnesses had time to absorb what everyone else thought they should have seen, there's a different pattern. Quieter one. The stories always sounded the same when people retold them years later, after they'd been interviewed a dozen times and appeared on television. But the witnesses didn't sound the same in those first hours and days. When you read the original police reports, when you listened to the recordings of those first phone calls to the sheriff's department, when you tracked down the people who saw it and never went public, there's something different in their voices. A hesitation, a confusion, an uncertainty about what they'd actually witnessed. Because what they saw didn't quite behave the way a monster should. It didn't behave the way a predator behaves. It didn't even behave the way a frightened animal behaves. It did something else entirely. Something that nobody knew how to categorize. Something that, in the rush to create a legend, got smoothed over and forgotten. One of the earliest documented sightings came from a woman driving home from her evening shift at a nursing home in Elkhorn. It was late October, 1989. A Tuesday night, cold enough that she had the heater on, but not so cold that there was frost yet. It was late, maybe 11 or midnight, the time of night when the roads are empty and you start to feel like you're the only person awake in the world. She was on Bray Road, heading south toward her house on the outskirts of town. The road was dark, no streetlights, just her headlights cutting through the darkness and the occasional reflector on a mailbox post. Her headlights swept across the road ahead as she came around a gentle curve, and there it was. Standing on the shoulder, maybe 10 feet from the pavement, right at the edge where the gravel meets the grass. Tall, upright, covered in dark fur that looked almost black in the headlights. She said later that her first thought wasn't fear. It was confusion. Her brain was trying to process what she was seeing, trying to fit it into a category that made sense. A person in a costume? But it was the middle of the night on an empty rural road. Bear. But it was standing too upright, too still, and bears don't stand like that. She slowed down. Not because she wanted to, but because her foot instinctively eased off the gas pedal. Her hands tightened on the wheel. The car rolled forward at maybe 15 miles per hour, and the thing didn't run. It didn't crouch or bare its teeth. It didn't make any aggressive movement at all. It turned its head and looked directly at her. She said the eyes reflected her headlights, bright and amber, the way a deer's or a dog's eyes would when caught in the light. But they didn't look away. They didn't dart to the side or blink rapidly the way an animal's eyes do when they're startled. They held her gaze for what felt like several seconds, but was probably closer to 5 or 6. Long enough that she could see details. Long enough that she felt like it was studying her as much as she was studying it. Then, calmly, almost deliberately, the creature turned away from the road and walked into the corn. Not running. Not crashing through the stalks in a panic. Walking. She said she could hear the stalks rustling as it moved through them, a sound that faded gradually as it moved deeper into the field. She sat there with her foot on the brake, engine idling, staring at the spot where it had disappeared. Then she drove home and didn't tell anyone for 2 days. When she finally did tell her husband, she kept saying the same thing over and over. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't hunting. It just looked at her. Like it was deciding something. Like it was figuring her out. Her husband asked her if she'd been scared. She said yes, but not in the way you'd expect. She said she felt scared the way you feel scared when you realize you've been watched for longer than you knew. Not the immediate terror of being in danger, but the creeping discomfort of realizing that something was aware of you before you were aware of it. Another report came in a few months later, February of 1990. A farmer was driving his pickup truck back from checking on livestock in one of his far fields. Same road, different time of night, around 1 or 2 in the morning. He saw something crossing ahead of him, moving from the north side of the road to the south, just at the edge of where his headlights reached. He stopped the truck completely, left it idling in the middle of the lane with the headlights pointed straight ahead. The thing paused in the center of the road, caught in the full glare of the headlights. He said it stood fully upright, taller than any man he'd ever seen, easily 6.5 feet, maybe more. Broad across the shoulders, arms hanging at its sides. It looked at the truck. Then it looked at him, directly at him through the windshield. He said he could see its breath in the cold air, vapor rising from its snout or mouth or whatever you want to call it. It didn't charge. It didn't bare its teeth or make any sound. It just stood there for a moment, as if deciding whether to stay or go. Then it continued walking, slow, unbothered. It climbed over the barbed wire fence on the far side of the road, one leg over and then the other, moving with a kind of careful grace, and disappeared into the field beyond. The farmer sat there with his truck idling for a full minute before he put it in gear and drove away. He said his hands were shaking, not from fear exactly, but from the strangeness of it, the wrongness. Not because it was monstrous, but because it was so deliberate, so calm. He told a friend about it a few weeks later, after a few beers loosened his tongue. The friend went quiet for a moment, then said he'd seen something similar years before, back in the early 80s, but never said anything because it sounded crazy. Who was going to believe him? What would he even say? That he saw a wolfman walking down the road like it owned the place? Both men described the same strange detail, the thing that stuck with them more than the size or the fur or the eyes. The posture. The way it moved. It didn't slink or prowl the way a predator does when it's hunting or stalking. It didn't move with the nervous energy of prey. It walked the way something walks when it's not afraid. When it knows the land. When it has every right to be there and doesn't care who sees it. Then there was the police officer. Deputy Sheriff, been on the force for maybe 5 or 6 years at that point. He was on patrol one night in the summer of 1991, circling through the rural roads on the western edge of the county, the kind of patrol where you're mostly just making sure nobody's broken into any barns or gone off the road after too many drinks. He was heading east on a small connector road that intersected with Bray Road when he saw it standing near a drainage ditch, maybe 20 feet off the shoulder. Perfectly still. Just standing there like it was waiting for something. He slowed down, put the car in park, and turned on his spotlight. The thing didn't flinch. It didn't run or crouch or show any sign of distress. It stood there in the full glare of the light, a 1,000-watt spotlight that could illuminate a field at 300 yards, and it just looked at him. He said later that he'd shined that spotlight on deer, coyotes, raccoons, even a black bear once, and they all reacted the same way. They froze for a split second and then they bolted. Pure instinct. But this thing didn't bolt. It stood there for what he estimated was 10 to 15 seconds, long enough that he reached for his radio to call it in, and then it turned and moved away. Not in a panic, but with purpose. Like it had decided the interaction was over. It had somewhere else to be. He radioed it in. Dispatch asked him to describe it. He struggled. He said it was large, upright, covered in dark fur, and moved like nothing he'd ever seen before. The dispatcher asked if it could have been a person in a costume. He said no. Not the way it moved. Not the proportions. The dispatcher asked if it could have been a bear. He said no, and he knew what bears looked like. There was a long pause on the radio. Then the dispatcher told him to file a report when he got back to the station. He did. The report went into a file with 3 others like it. Nobody knew what to do with them. When asked later to describe it in more detail, for a newspaper article that ran about a year after the sighting, he kept coming back to the same thing. It didn't act like an animal. It didn't act scared, or aggressive, or even particularly interested in him. It acted like it had been interrupted. Like it was in the middle of something, and he'd happened to show up. He said the thing that bothered him most wasn't what he saw. It was the feeling he had while it was looking at him. Like he was the intruder. Like he was the one who didn't belong. Predators don't stop like that. They don't stand and observe, not when they're exposed, not when there's a threat present. They don't move slowly when they're caught in the open. Predators are fast, instinctive, reactive. They attack or they flee. Those are the 2 options hardwired into their brains by millions of years of evolution. But something else does stop. Something curious. Something intelligent. Something that's watching, not hunting. Something that's trying to understand what you are, the same way you're trying to understand what it is. When you lay out the reports chronologically, when you mark them on a map and note the times and dates and circumstances, certain patterns emerge. Patterns that tell a story if you know how to read them. The sightings happened almost exclusively between 10 p.m. and 3 a.m., the dead hours of the night when most people are asleep and the roads are empty. Most occurred on back roads with little to no traffic, roads that didn't lead anywhere important, roads that existed mainly to connect farm properties to the main highways. The locations clustered around the same few-mile radius, always rural, always near wooded areas or farmland with tall crops. Corn, mostly, but also soybean fields and patches of oak forest that had somehow survived the clearing. The thing was seen most often in late summer and early fall, July through October, when the corn is high and the nights were still warm enough that people had their windows down, that they could hear the insects and the wind and the rustling of leaves. Winter sightings were rare. Spring sightings even rarer. It was as if the creature had a season, a time when it was active and visible, and the rest of the year it either left or went dormant or hid so effectively that no one ever caught a glimpse. But here's what's more interesting than what happened. Here's what never happened. No one was ever attacked. Not once. Not a single witness reported any aggressive behavior directed at them. No cars were damaged. No one found scratches on their doors or dents in their hoods. No livestock were killed or mutilated in the surrounding farms. No chickens taken from coops. No calves found torn apart in the fields. No hunters found unusual tracks or scat that couldn't be identified as coming from known animals. No bodies, animal or otherwise, turned up in the area that couldn't be explained by normal predators like coyotes, the occasional black bear passing through, or domestic dogs that had gone feral. In a typical monster story, whether it's fiction or folklore or urban legend, there's escalation. The creature gets bolder. It moves closer to human habitation. People get hurt slowly at first, a missing pet here, a mauled hiker there, and then more dramatically, more violently, until finally someone is killed and the community has to come together to hunt the thing down. Evidence piles up. Photos, tracks, physical proof that something dangerous is out there. But that didn't happen here. The sightings were consistent, but they were also strangely passive. The thing was seen. It was observed. But it didn't do anything. It didn't threaten anyone. It didn't invade anyone's property beyond crossing through fields and walking along public roads. It just existed in the same space humans were traveling through, and occasionally the two overlapped. Multiple witnesses described the same eerie behavior, and this is where the legend starts to fall apart if you pay attention. The creature would stop and watch, not from a safe distance, not from deep in the woods where it could observe without being seen. It would stop close to the road, close enough that its eyes could be seen clearly in the headlights, close enough that people could make out details of its shape, its fur, the way its chest moved when it breathed. And then it would leave, calmly, almost methodically, like it had finished whatever it came to do, like it had gathered whatever information it needed. One man who saw it twice in the same month, once in late August and again in early September of 1992, said something that stuck with me when I read his interview in the county library's newspaper archives. He said the second time he saw it, he felt like it recognized his truck, like it knew he'd been there before. He said the first time, it had stood and stared for a long moment before walking away. The second time, it barely paused. It looked at him, looked at the truck, and then just walked away almost immediately, like it had already decided he wasn't a threat, like it had categorized him and moved on. If it wasn't hunting, and it wasn't defending territory, and it wasn't avoiding humans out of fear the way normal wild animals do, then what was it doing? Why was it always on that road? Why always at night? Why always watching? These are the questions nobody seemed to ask, or if they did ask them, they never pursued the answers. It was easier to call it a monster and leave it at that. Easier to say it was dangerous and unknowable than to sit with the uncomfortable possibility that maybe it wasn't dangerous at all. That maybe it was just as confused about us as we were about it. Some of the witnesses, the ones who saw it more than once or who had longer sightings, said they felt like they were being studied. Not stalked. Not hunted. Studied. Like the thing was trying to understand them. Trying to figure out what these vehicles were, why they came down this road at night, what the lights meant, what the sound meant. One woman said she felt like it was trying to predict her. She drove the same route home from work 5 nights a week, always around 11 p.m., and she saw it 3 times over the course of a month, always in roughly the same area. She said by the 3rd time, she had the distinct impression it was expecting her. That it was there deliberately at that time because it knew she would be. Or maybe, she said, And this is what really struck me when I talked to her years later. Maybe he was trying to remember them. The cars, the people, the patterns of human movement through what used to be empty land. Maybe he was keeping track, building a map in its mind of where the humans went and when they went there. Not to avoid them, necessarily, but to understand them. To make sense of a landscape that had changed so completely that the rules of survival had become unrecognizable. By the early 1990s, after the newspaper articles and the television coverage, after the story had been picked up by paranormal magazines and late-night radio shows, the story had spread far enough that people outside Elkhorn knew about it. The local curiosity, the mixture of fear and fascination that had initially greeted the sightings, turned into something else. Something more aggressive. Something darker. Groups of men started organizing nighttime patrols. They called it protecting the community, civic duty, making sure nobody got hurt, but really they were hunting. Pickup trucks loaded with rifles and shotguns and spotlights powerful enough to illuminate a football field, rolling slowly down Bray Road and the surrounding back roads, windows down, engines rumbling, looking for something to shoot. Looking for something to kill. Looking to be the one who brought back proof, who ended the mystery, who could say they'd taken down the Beast of Bray Road. Some of them were locals. Farmers who had lived in the area their whole lives, mechanics who worked on the tractors and combines that kept the farms running, construction workers and factory workers, and retired veterans who grew up hunting deer and turkey and didn't like the idea of something strange in their backyard. Something they couldn't identify. Something that made people nervous. Others came from neighboring towns, from other counties, amateur hunters who wanted to be part of the story, who wanted to be the one who finally captured or killed the thing everyone was talking about. They'd meet in parking lots before heading out, comparing rifles, sharing thermoses of coffee spiked with whiskey, talking strategy like they were planning a military operation. Some brought walkie-talkies so they could coordinate. Others just agreed on a route and a time and hoped they'd all end up in the right place. They'd park on the shoulder with the headlights off, sitting in the dark with the windows down, listening. Listening for the sound of something moving through the corn, the snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, anything that might indicate the creature was nearby. They'd drive in loops, circling the same few miles over and over, radios crackling with updates. Nothing yet. Still looking. Thought I saw something, but it was just a deer. There were stories of shots fired into the woods. Someone claimed they saw it running between trees and unloaded half a magazine in its direction. The muzzle flash lighting up the forest, brass casings clinking onto the road. They said they hit it. They were sure they'd hit it. But when they went to look the next morning, there was no blood. No tracks. No fur caught on branches. Nothing. Another group said they tracked it to a soybean field and surrounded the area. 5 or 6 trucks parked in a perimeter with their spotlights pointed inward, turning the field into something like a prison yard at night. They moved in slowly, rifles raised, expecting to find it cornered and desperate. But by the time they'd closed the circle, whatever had been there was gone. No blood. No tracks. Nothing. Some of the locals tried to put a stop to it. The owner of one of the larger farms put up no trespassing signs and threatened to call the sheriff if he saw any more armed groups on his property. The county sheriff himself put out a statement asking people to stop discharging firearms on public roads, reminding everyone that it was illegal and dangerous and that nobody had any proof that there was anything out there worth shooting at. But it didn't really stop. It just became quieter, more secretive. People stopped talking about it openly, but they kept doing it. Kept loading up their trucks, kept driving those roads at night, kept hoping they'd be the ones to see it. It's hard to say exactly how long this went on, but it lasted at least a few years, maybe longer. Long enough that it became a kind of local tradition, a rite of passage for young men looking to prove themselves. Long enough that people who lived on Bray Road got used to seeing strangers parked on their property at 2 a.m, rifles resting on dashboard mounts, faces lit by the glow of cigarettes. Long enough that the county sheriff had to respond to multiple calls about shots fired, had to drive out and tell people to go home, had to file reports that went nowhere because nobody was actually getting hurt and nobody could prove there was anything illegal happening beyond the discharge of firearms. And that's when the sightings changed. It's a small detail, easy to miss if you're not paying attention, easy to dismiss as coincidence or the natural decline of a local legend that's run its course. But after the hunting started, after the armed patrols became a regular occurrence, the reports shifted in character. The thing stopped appearing on the road. It stopped standing in the open, stopped letting itself be caught in the full glare of headlights. The few sightings that came in after 1994 or 1995 described something much more cautious, much more aware of the danger. Witnesses saw it at a distance, barely visible in the tree line. Just a shape, a suggestion of something large and upright moving between the trees. One person said they saw it watching from behind a barn, only visible because the moonlight caught its eyes for a split second before it moved back into shadow. Another said it moved through the corn so quietly they only noticed it because the stalks shifted against the direction of the wind, a narrow path of movement that disappeared almost as soon as they saw it. It stopped lingering. It stopped waiting. It stopped standing still long enough for people to get a good look. The sightings became faster, briefer, more ambiguous. People weren't sure anymore if they'd really seen something, or if their mind was filling in shapes in the darkness. The certainty that had characterized the earlier reports, the clear descriptions and confident statements, gave way to doubt and hesitation. Maybe it was a deer. Maybe it was a shadow. Maybe it was nothing. It learned. That's what happened. It learned that the roads weren't safe anymore. That the lights didn't just mean cars passing through. They meant people with guns looking for it. That standing and watching could get it killed. So it stopped. It adapted its behavior in response to the threat. Not because it was a mindless animal reacting on instinct, but because it was intelligent enough to recognize a pattern and change its behavior to survive. There's something darkly funny about it. In a way, if you can step back far enough to see the absurdity. Americans with guns, convinced they're the apex predator, loading up their trucks to hunt something they couldn't even prove existed. Something they couldn't identify, couldn't track, couldn't understand. And the thing they were hunting watched them come, figured out what they were doing, and adapted. It stopped letting itself be seen. Not because it was afraid of the land or the night or the natural dangers of its environment. Because it was afraid of them. Of us. Of what we would do if we got the chance. The later reports, the ones that came in through the mid to late 90s and into the early 2000s, are different in tone. Different in substance. The fear is still there in the voices of the witnesses, still audible in the recordings and visible in the written statements, but it's mixed with something else. Confusion, uncertainty, sometimes even guilt, sometimes something close to sadness. The witnesses describe a creature that no longer seems curious or calm, no longer seems like it's observing from a position of confidence or control. It seems wary, skittish, defensive, like something that's been hunted and knows it. One woman who lived on a property that backed up to a small patch of forest saw it one evening in 1997, just as the sun was going down. She was in her kitchen washing dishes, looking out the window at her backyard, when she saw it standing near the edge of her property, between two oak trees. She said it wasn't looking at her house. It wasn't moving toward her. It was looking past the house, toward the road maybe 200 yards away. Like it was watching for something. Waiting for something. She said it stayed there for maybe 20 or 30 seconds, perfectly still, and then it turned and moved deeper into the woods. Quick, purposeful movements. She never felt threatened. She felt like she'd interrupted something. Like it was checking to see if the coast was clear, and her presence had spoiled whatever it was planning to do. A man driving home late one night in 1999 said he saw it cross the road far ahead of him, maybe 200 yards out, just barely visible in the reach of his headlights. It moved fast at first, low to the ground, almost on all fours, and then it stood and ran upright into the ditch on the far side. He said it looked over its shoulder twice while it was running. Not at him. At the road behind him. Like it was expecting someone else. Like it thought there might be more than one vehicle, more than one threat. He slowed down as he approached the spot where it had crossed, but by the time he got there, it was long gone. Another witness, a teenager at the time, maybe 16 or 17 years old, said he saw it in 2001, standing near a cornfield just off the shoulder of the road. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there, absolutely motionless, staring down the road in the direction of town. He said he was driving pretty fast, not paying much attention, and when he saw it, he instinctively slowed down. As he passed, maybe 20 feet away, the thing turned its head sharply, like it had just noticed him, like it had been so focused on something else that it hadn't heard the car approaching. He said the look on its face, if you could call it a face, wasn't angry. It wasn't aggressive. It was startled, maybe even frightened. It bolted into the corn before he'd even fully passed, crashing through the stalks in a way that suggested panic rather than the calm, measured movements described in the earlier reports. These later sightings have a different quality. The creature isn't observing anymore. It's not curious. It's not trying to understand what the cars are or who the people inside them are. It's just trying not to be seen, trying to move through a landscape that's become dangerous, trying to survive. There's one report that stayed with me more than the others that I keep coming back to whenever I think about what happened on Bray Road. A farmer, older guy, in his 60s at the time, saw it one morning in the fall of 2002. He was up early, before dawn, getting ready to head out to his fields. It was still dark outside, that deep pre-dawn darkness where the world feels like it holding its breath. He looked out his window and saw it standing near the tree line at the far edge of his property, maybe 150 yards from the house. Just standing there, completely still, facing the trees. He said he watched it for several minutes. He didn't feel scared. He didn't feel threatened. He just watched. He said it didn't move. It didn't do anything. It just stood there, facing the woods, like it was waiting for something, or saying goodbye to something, like it was standing at the edge of a threshold, deciding whether to cross. He said he didn't feel scared. He felt sad. He said it looked tired. He couldn't explain exactly what he meant by that, how you could tell something like that from a distance in the dark, but he kept saying it. It looked tired, like it had been running for a long time and had finally stopped, like it had finally reached the end of something. When the sun started to rise, when the first light started breaking over the horizon and the darkness began to fade to gray, it turned and walked into the woods. Slowly, deliberately, not running, not hiding, just walking, like it had made a decision. He never saw it again. That's when I started thinking about it differently. Not as a creature that was hiding from people out of some natural animal instinct to avoid predators, but as something that had been displaced, pushed out, forced to move through a landscape that used to be its own, that it used to know and understand, but wasn't anymore. Not because of the roads or the cars or the houses. Those things had been there for decades, and it had learned to navigate around them. But because the people in those cars and houses had decided it didn't belong, had decided it was a threat, had come looking for it with guns and spotlights and the absolute certainty that they had the right to kill it. It wasn't hunting. It had never been hunting. It wasn't threatening anyone. It was just trying to exist, just trying to move through the world the way it always had. And the more it tried, the more dangerous that existence became. Not because of the natural dangers of the world, not because of other predators or lack of food or harsh winters. Because of us. Because we saw something we didn't understand and decided the appropriate response was violence. It learned to be afraid. Not of cars, not of lights, of us. To understand what the Beast of Bray Road might have been, you have to understand what that land was before it became Bray Road. Before it was farmland. Before it was a place people drove through on their way to somewhere else. Before it was divided into parcels and property lines and addresses that appear on GPS maps. Southeastern Wisconsin used to be dense forest and wetlands. Oak savannas and tall grass prairies stretched for miles, interrupted by rivers and marshes and small lakes. The area around what's now Elkhorn was covered in maple and oak and hickory trees, thick enough that the canopy blocked out most of the sunlight, thick enough that you could walk for hours without seeing the sky. In the low areas, cattails and sedge grass grew in standing water that never fully drained, creating wetlands that were home to herons and cranes and muskrats and countless species of insects and amphibians. The land was home to the Potawatomi people for generations before European settlers arrived in the early 1800s. They called it something else, a name that's been lost or deliberately erased, a name that probably described the shape of the land or the way the water moved through it or the animals that lived there. They hunted here, fished here, moved through the landscape seasonally, following the migrations of animals and the ripening of plants. They knew the land in a way that's hard for us to understand now. Knew it not as property to be owned, but as a living system to be part of. Then the land was taken. Treaties were signed, often under coercion, often broken before the ink was dry. The Potawatomi were forced west, removed from the land they'd lived on for countless generations. And the settlers came in with axes and plows and a vision of what the land should be. The forests were cut down to make way for farms. The wetlands were drained. The rivers were dammed and redirected. The prairie was plowed under and replaced with wheat and corn and soybeans. The animals that lived there, the large predators that had been part of the ecosystem for thousands of years, were systematically killed. Bears, wolves, cougars, all of them were shot, trapped, poisoned, pushed further and further north until they were functionally extinct in southern Wisconsin. By the time the 20th century rolled around, by the time Bray Road was paved and given a name, the landscape looked nothing like it had 100 years before. The wildness was gone, replaced by grid roads and cornfields and small towns connected by two-lane highways. The land had been conquered, tamed, made productive and profitable. There was no room left for anything that didn't fit into that vision. No room for mystery or wilderness or things that couldn't be controlled. But every once in a while, maybe once a generation, maybe more often, people would see something that didn't fit. Something that seemed like it belonged to an older version of that place. A version that didn't exist anymore, except in fragments and memories, and the thin strips of forest that had somehow survived between farm properties. Something that moved through the landscape like it remembered what it used to be. Like it had been there all along, watching the changes, adapting to them, learning to hide. The Potawatomi have stories about creatures that walked upright, that live in the forests and wetlands, that were neither fully animal nor fully human. Different tribes have different names for them, different versions of the stories, but the core is the same. Guardians, some called them. Spirits of the land. Beings that existed in the spaces between the known and the unknown, between the human world and the natural world. They were protectors of sacred places, watchers of boundaries, witnesses to events that humans couldn't or shouldn't see. When the land changed, when the forests were cut and the wetlands were drained and the indigenous people were forced away, those stories were dismissed as folklore. Superstition. Primitive myths from a people who didn't understand the natural world the way Europeans did, who saw spirits and magic where there was only biology and physics. But the people who told those stories didn't think of them that way. They thought of them as memory, as history, as truth passed down through generations, truth that described real things that existed in the real world, even if they couldn't be easily categorized or understood. What if the Beast of Bray Road wasn't a monster? What if it wasn't even a cryptid in the way people use that word, some unknown species waiting to be discovered and cataloged and displayed in a museum? What if it was something that had always been there, something that existed in that landscape long before roads and farms and spotlights? Not a predator in the biological sense. Not an animal in the way we understand animals, driven purely by instinct and the need to eat and reproduce. But something older, something more complex, something that existed in the space between what we can explain and what we can't. The witnesses described something that moved with purpose, that observed without attacking, that seemed to understand what cars were, what roads meant, what humans represented. That's not the behavior of a wild animal encountering civilization for the first time. That's not a bear or a wolf or even an undiscovered primate species stumbling into human territory by accident. That's the behavior of something that's been watching civilization encroach for a long time. Something that's been adapting to it, learning from it, trying to coexist with it in whatever way possible. Maybe it wasn't a monster. Maybe it was a witness. The last one. Standing on the side of the road, watching the headlights pass, remembering when there were no roads at all. When there was only forest and darkness and silence, and the sound of water moving through the land. When it didn't have to hide. When it could move freely, openly, without fear. When the land was whole and wild and full of things that humans would never see, never understand, never control. Maybe it was a guardian, still trying to protect something even though there was almost nothing left to protect. Maybe it was trying to understand what had happened, why the world had changed so completely, why the humans kept coming and building and cutting and taking. Maybe it was just trying to survive in a world that had decided there was no place for anything that couldn't be explained or controlled or put to use. Or maybe it was something we don't have words for. Something our categories can't contain. Something that's older and stranger than our mythology allows for. And maybe that's why we call it a monster. Because calling it a monster is easier than admitting we don't know. Easier than sitting with the discomfort of something that doesn't fit into our understanding of how the world works. Easier than asking ourselves what we've lost by making the world so small, so tame, so completely under our control that there's no room left for mystery. The last widely reported sighting of the Beast of Bray Road happened in the early 2000s. The exact year varies depending on who you ask, depending on which database you're looking at, depending on whether you count the vague, uncertain reports or only the ones that came with detailed descriptions and credible witnesses. By then, the story had faded from the local news. The hunters had moved on to other obsessions. The paranormal investigators had gone quiet, moved on to other mysteries in other places. Bray Road was just a road again. People drove down it every day without thinking about what might be watching from the tree line. The legend had become a curiosity, something you'd mention to visitors or bring up after a few drinks, but not something anyone took seriously anymore. But one night, someone saw it one more time. A man driving home alone later than he should have been. He'd been visiting a friend in a neighboring county, lost track of time, ended up leaving around 2 in the morning. He was tired, running on coffee, and the kind of restless energy that keeps you awake when your body wants to sleep. He was on Bray Road, heading east, back toward Elkhorn. The road was empty. No other cars. No lights except his headlights and the occasional farmhouse glow in the distance. He came around a wide, gentle curve, the kind of curve you barely notice during the day, but feels significant at night when the headlights sweep across empty fields and dark tree lines. And there it was, standing on the shoulder, right at the edge of where the headlights reached, exactly where the light started to fade into shadow. Tall, upright, the posture unmistakable, the shape impossible to misidentify. He said his first thought wasn't fear. It was recognition. Like seeing someone you used to know, but haven't seen in years. Like the memory of something clicking into place. He stopped the car. He said he didn't consciously decide to stop, but his foot hit the brake and the car rolled to a halt maybe 30 or 40 feet from where the thing was standing. He sat there with the engine idling, both hands on the wheel, staring. And the thing didn't move. Didn't turn around. It was facing away from him, away from the road, looking back into the trees, into the darkness beyond the reach of his headlights. He said he sat there for maybe a minute, maybe longer. Time felt strange, elastic, like it does in dreams or moments of intense focus. He could hear the engine running, could hear the faint sound of the radio playing something he couldn't identify, could hear his own breathing. But he couldn't hear anything from outside. No insects, no wind, no rustling of leaves or snapping of branches. Just silence. And then the creature took one step forward, into the trees. Then another. Slow, deliberate steps. Not running. Not fleeing. Just walking. The way you walk when you've decided something, and there's no reason to hurry. The darkness swallowed it almost immediately, the headlights unable to penetrate more than a few feet into the woods. He watched the spot where it had disappeared, waiting for some sign of movement, some indication of where it had gone. But there was nothing. Just the trees and the darkness and the silence. He said he didn't feel afraid. He felt like he'd witnessed the end of something. Like he'd seen the last page of a story he'd been reading for years without knowing it. He sat there in the dark for a long time after it left, staring at the empty space where it had been, trying to understand what he'd just seen, trying to figure out if he should follow it, if he should get out of the car and walk into those trees and try to find it. But he didn't. He sat there until the moment felt complete, until whatever spell or trance or state of heightened awareness he'd been in finally broke. Then he drove home and didn't tell anyone for years. When he finally did tell someone, when he finally shared the story with a researcher who was still collecting reports, still trying to piece together the full timeline of sightings, he said the thing that stayed with him wasn't what he saw. It was the feeling he had while he was watching it. He said it felt like watching something leave the world. Not dying, not being killed or destroyed. Just leaving, going somewhere people couldn't follow. Choosing to disappear rather than continue existing in a place that had become hostile. A place where its presence was considered a threat, where its existence was something to be feared and hunted rather than wondered at or respected. He said he wished he'd gotten out of the car, wished he'd tried to say something, even if it couldn't understand, even if it made no sense. He said he wanted to apologize. For what, he couldn't quite articulate. For the roads, maybe. For the farms. For the men with guns. For the fear and the violence and the assumption that anything unknown must be dangerous. For the way we've made the world so small and controlled that there's no room left for anything we can't explain. That was it. That was the last time. There have been no credible sightings since. No new reports filed with the police. No witnesses coming forward with stories of late-night encounters. No footprints found in the mud after rain. No photographs, no video, no physical evidence of any kind. The Beast of Bray Road, whatever it was, stopped appearing. Maybe it left, moved further north into the remaining wild places where people are scarce and the land is still big enough to hide in. Maybe it learned to hide so well that no one will ever see it again, adapting its behavior to the point where it's become completely invisible. Or maybe it finally gave up, realized that the land it remembered didn't exist anymore, that there was no place left for something like it, that the world had changed too much, had become too dangerous, had filled up with too many humans who would rather kill what they don't understand and let it be. Bray Road is still there. You can drive down it right now if you want. You can get in your car, pull up the GPS coordinates, and follow the blue line on your phone until you're driving the same stretch of asphalt that all those witnesses drove decades ago. The corn still grows tall in the summer. The fog still rolls in at night, thick and low, settling in the ditches and between the rows of crops. The road is the same cracked asphalt it's always been, patched and repaired over the years but fundamentally unchanged, cutting through farmland that looks like it hasn't changed in decades. People still live there. They wake up in the morning and drive to work. They come home late, tired, thinking about dinner and bills and whether the kids finish their homework. They take the same turns their parents took, drive past the same barns and silos and farmhouses. Most of them have heard the story. Some of them believe it. Some of them think it was mass hysteria, people seeing what they wanted to see, imagination filling in shapes in the darkness and turning shadows into monsters. Some of them think it was misidentified animals, bears standing on their hind legs, large dogs running loose, the human brain's tendency to see patterns and faces where none exist. Some of them don't think about it at all. But every once in a while, late at night, someone will slow down on that stretch of road. They'll look out into the darkness past their headlights, scanning the tree line, the ditches, the fields. They'll look for shapes that don't belong, for movement that can't be explained by wind or passing animals. And they'll wonder, not if the beast is still there, but if it ever was. And if it was, what it thought of them. The people in the cars. The ones who built the roads and cleared the forests and divided the land into parcels and decided what belonged and what didn't. The Beast of Bray Road was never hunting. That's the conclusion I've come to after years of reading through reports, after talking to witnesses, after driving those roads at every hour of the day and night. It never killed anyone. It never even threatened anyone. It didn't attack livestock or damage property or do any of the things we associate with predators, with creatures that pose a danger to humans. It just existed in a place that used to be its own. It walked the same paths it had probably walked for generations, maybe centuries, through a landscape that had changed around it but that it still knew, still remembered. And when people decided that was unacceptable, when they showed up with guns and spotlights and the absolute certainty that they were the ones who belonged there, that anything they couldn't identify or understand must be a threat, it adapted. It learned. It hid. And eventually it left. Or went so deep into hiding that it might as well have left. The result is the same either way. Humans were the ones hunting. We always were. We hunted it with fear, with assumptions, with violence we justified as protection. We hunted it with our refusal to accept that something could exist outside our understanding, outside our categories, outside our control. We hunted it with our need to be the dominant species, the apex predator, the only thing that gets to decide what lives and what dies in the spaces we've claimed. We hunted it off land it knew before we did, land that held memories we'll never access, land that was whole and wild before we cut it into pieces and gave it names and turned it into something productive. And whatever lived there, whatever walked upright down that road on quiet nights, staring back at the headlights with eyes that reflected the light like an animal's but held a gaze like a person's, it learned. It learned what we were capable of. It learned what we do to things we don't understand, to things that frighten us, to things that remind us that we're not as in control as we like to believe. It learned that coexistence wasn't possible, not because it couldn't adapt, but because we couldn't. Because we'd rather destroy mystery than live alongside it. The Beast of Bray Road was never the monster in this story. It was just the thing we decided was monstrous. The thing we needed to be monstrous so we could justify our fear, our aggression, our need to eliminate it. The real question isn't whether it was real. The witnesses saw something. The reports are too consistent, too detailed, too specific to dismiss entirely. The real question is what we lost when we drove it away. What we gave up when we chose control over wonder, certainty over mystery, domination over coexistence. And whether it's still out there, somewhere past the tree line, somewhere in the fragments of wild land that still exist between the farms and the roads and the towns, whether it's still watching us the way it always did, not with hunger, not with hate, not with any intention to harm, but with a quiet, patient understanding of something that's seen this all before, that's watched humans arrive and claim and conquer and destroy, that knows how the story ends. The road is still there. The darkness is still there. The land is still there, even if it's been changed almost beyond recognition. But the beast is gone. And maybe that's the saddest part of all. Not that we don't know what it was, but that we'll never get the chance to find out. That we chose fear over curiosity, violence over understanding, and now the opportunity is lost. Whatever it was, whatever it could have taught us about the world and our place in it, whatever mysteries it held, they're gone now. Driven away, or hidden so deep they'll never surface again. And we're left with just the legend. Just the stories people tell. Just the question of what really lived on Bray Road and why we couldn't let it be. E&D.